Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series on YouTube. I'm back after a hiatus of several days. I think today is Sunday and the last one was on a Tuesday. Wow, that's probably the longest break that I've taken since I started. It wasn't a deliberate break. Two things happened. One was that we reached the end of that particular book. On the 23rd of November 1917, an odd place to end a diary volume, but Dmitri wrote so much that he went through several diaries a year. So he reached the end on 23 November. And I remarked that I don't have a pre-existing translation of the next diary, the next diary volume. And so I need to take my microfilm copies of Dmitri's diaries to the local public library and get them digitized, do that myself. And I have not had a chance to do that. The other reason, more superficially, was just that the last video I did, I think it took several days for it to get more than 4 views, and that was a little discouraging, I have to be honest. I don't know what it was with that particular one, but anyway, having not gone and done the digitizing of the next diary volume, which is, sounds like it would take a long time, but it doesn't. A person can do 100 pages in less than an hour. Anyway, since I haven't done that, I have some text from 1908 today as an interim thing, a letter that Dmitri wrote to his sister from the Crimea on the 31st of August, 1908, a Sunday, like it is today as I do this. And before we get into that, a few words about the previous video, which was November 23rd, 1917. Dmitri was depressed and had some really bitter words for what was going on at that time, because bad news, after a period of being, a little bit hopeful, bad news had started piling up. He found out that his father had been arrested a second time, or was under arrest. He thought it was the second arrest, but I'm not sure if it wasn't just a continuation of the first one. He found out that a hardliner Bolshevik with no real military background, Krylenko, had taken over as supreme commander of the Russian army and was intent upon signing a separate peace. And, he was agonizing over the knowledge that there was not enough unity in the Caucasus for anything to come of the struggle against the Bolsheviks there. So, feeling quite depressed. And now he's not depressed. On 31st August 1908, some important background information. Maria had gotten married earlier that year, I think April or May, and so this is August, so it hadn't been very long. Dmitri had been away from her for the first time in his life for a long period of time, but he'd just been visiting her in Sweden, as you'll see. He was 17 years old, and he was still in Ella's custody. He was not on his own at 17. He wasn't able to decide how he was going to spend his time and where he was going to go. If Ella went somewhere, he went with her, whether he wanted to or not. And in this instance, I think he did want to. But, okay, let's dive in. One last thing, he wrote this letter in 2 parts, so it has 2 dates. The first part of the letter he wrote on that Sunday, and then he had to set it aside and resume it the next day, on Monday, the 1st of November. So I decided it's not terribly long. I probably could have fit it into one video, but I decided to break it in 2. So here we go. Dear Maria, guarding in my heart my best, brightest, most joyful memory of my visit to Sweden, I have sat down to write to you and express my sincere gratitude, etc. As you probably already understand, I didn't send you a telegram on the way home because I consider that practice stupid. The journey from Sweden to Abo was ideal. The boat rocked terribly in the night, but I didn't get sick. We were, incidentally, accompanied by a certain gentleman in a very worn-out frock coat and top hat. He watched us suspiciously, but then it turned out that he was the assistant to the police chief of Abo. So a couple of asides here. Abo was in Finland, and when Dmitri says we, he's not talking about himself and Ella. In this instance, he was allowed to go visit his sister on his own in Sweden, but accompanied by the man who was still his sort of adult guardian and teacher, G.M. Laming. Okay, resuming with Abo. In that city, we were entertained by the governor all day. We scoured the city like tourists and left at 5 o'clock p.m. At a station called Riki Miyaki, they fed us a dinner specially prepared for us. While we were there, I had a sad memory of you because the woman who served us was in a very interesting condition. Forgive me, please. We spent a day and a night in Petersburg. I dined at the home of Countess Mengden, the belle-sœur of the Count. She asked me to give you her most respectful greetings. The weather was horrible in Petersburg, up to 2 degrees of frost, but no, 2 degrees of warmth. But in order to avoid writing a too lengthy letter, I'll just say one thing about the journey from Petersburg to the Crimea. It was frightfully hot and dusty on the train. Well, we finally reached Sevastopol, had lunch, and set off in an automobile. And he underlines the word automobile. Yes, Maria, namely in an automobile rented for that occasion. We passed through Baidar and arrived in Koreiz. That's Koreiz, about 3 hours later. It's about 7 versts from Baidar. We were met by Prince Yusupov, Kornilov, and Maria Nikolaevna, also with an automobile. Okay, they came in an automobile. The heat was pretty impressive, one could say. The dust was terrible and the shaking unbearable, so I now have a new respect for you, having gone 500 kilometers in one day. Aunt met us at our cottage. She's a little thin, but she looks good. Naturally, she was wearing her habit. Vera Ivanovna has gotten terribly fat, and Valentina Sergeyevna has gotten a bit thin, like Aunt. But everything is blank. That's the word, blank. Well, after the first blank and inspection, we were given tea and were able to relax. Yesterday, Minnie came to tea and invited us to go with her today to the new church for the liturgy, which we did. All right, I offer a blanket apology for all of the mispronunciations, beginning probably with Abo and the stop in Finland and going through to the names of the places in the Crimea. And yes, let me see, where do we go with this? All right, well, I've already spoken about Abo, so, obviously they took a boat of some kind, ship. I don't know how long a trip that was. They spent one night aboard from Sweden to this town in Finland. Finland was, of course, part of the Russian Empire at that time. And yeah, it's interesting that, so here's this shabby looking man who's watching them everywhere they go, and apparently they have no idea who this fellow is. They only find out later that he's, what is he? An assistant to the police chief in Abo. So he's there for security reasons. But, they kind of are feeling like they're being watched by this suspicious and shabby looking fellow who's wearing a worn out frock coat. It's really interesting, isn't it, that he didn't introduce himself, or they didn't get a telegram before they left saying this man will be with you on the, as a protective measure, so don't be alarmed, and that he was able to get that close and to, sort of tail them and keep an eye on them on the boat. You would think that they would have, and maybe that's a misconception. I mean, maybe it wasn't that way back then. I don't think it was. You know, back at the time of Alexander II, the Tsar would take a walk in the public gardens. And so, you know, even after the assassination of Sergei, it seems like, you know, there would have been sort of looser division between the members of the royal family and the public. Okay, anyway, yeah, so Dmitri feels a little homesick for Maria when they have this dinner at the station because the waitress is pregnant. And so he uses euphemistic language. She was in a very interesting condition. So Maria was pregnant. This reminded him of his sister, but he can't use the word pregnant. He has to say interesting condition, and he has to put in parentheses, forgive me, please. You know, that was him being ironic, but you know, indeed, it would not have been considered polite at that time to have noticed, I think, that a woman, or for a young man, that a woman was pregnant, because, God forbid, that meant an acknowledging that she had had sex. And I remember even in the 1950s with the American sitcom I Love Lucy, where there was a period when both the character and the actress, Lucille Ball, were pregnant, and the censors wouldn't allow them to use the word pregnant. They had to find, you know, euphemistic expressions for that. So that was kind of a thing that lasted quite a while, funnily enough. Okay, the Mengdens. Yeah, the Mengdens are everywhere. So there are so many of them that it's hard to keep track of them, but one of them was the head of sort of the major domo, but not a servant, a gentleman, even aristocratic person who was the head of Grand Duke Sergei's household. So Dmitri and Maria, as long as they were living with Sergei and Ella, were, you know, on a sort of close what am I trying to say? There were always Mengdens around, and they were almost en famille with the Mengdens and socialized with them. And so there were lots of Mengdens attached to other Grand Dukes. There was one who was a lady in waiting. So I'm not sure exactly what the relationship here. She's Countess Mengden. She's the sister-in-law of the Count. I assume the Count was the one who was the head of Sergei's household. She asked Dmitri to pass on her greetings to Maria. Yeah, funny that they rented a car once they arrived in Crimea, in Sevastopol. They rented a car to get to the Yusupov estate. I guess that makes sense, even though, you know, Dmitri was a Grand Duke. Nobody was sending a car to pick him up. They just rented one. It wasn't a fun trip, obviously. Yes, and Ella is there to meet him. She was a very close friend of Princess Zinaida Yusupova. They were quite close, and so apparently Sergei had never had his own estate in the Crimea. I don't recall ever hearing about him going to the Crimea. He was a real Muscovite, and he had his country estate outside of Moscow, Ilinskaya, that he went to in the summer. Anyway, Ella is staying in the cottage on the Yusupov estate, and Dmitri sees her. It's not clear if it's the first time, probably not, but he finds it noteworthy to mention to his sister that she was wearing her habit. So, you know, she had now officially taken her vows. She still would have custody of Dmitri for another year or even two. I can't remember. I think he moved to Petersburg in 1909. But she had kind of put that off, if I understand it correctly, going full monastic until the kids were both out of the house. So anyway, yeah, maybe it was a little bit of a novelty still for him to see her in her nun's habit. He mentions these two women, Vera Ivanova, no, I'm not sure where the stress is on that patronymic, and Valentina Sergeyevna. Now, they might have been nuns, or they might have been ladies in waiting, or they might have been kind of lady in waiting nuns. But Dmitri clearly was used to them. Clearly, they were part of her entourage. And so they were kind of funny. He describes them. One is terribly fat. One has gotten thin. So sort of an odd couple. He expresses a little concern. So lately, Ella has been sick, and we'll find out more about that. She's had health problems, and she's gotten thin, and he thought she was wearing herself out. And I see that I skipped the people who met them. When they reached Baidar, they were met by three people. Prince Yusupov, this is not the younger Felix Yusupov, this is the elder Felix Felixovich Yusupov. He's the host, he meets them. There's Maria Nikolaevna, she is Laming's wife. So her husband is arriving with Dmitri, so she joins the party to go and meet them. And then there's this Kornilov, and that's intriguing. It obviously is not the Kornilov who became the supreme commander of the Russian military forces in 1917 and led this unsuccessful march on Petrograd. Lavra Kornilov. It definitely was not him. He was not in the country. He was in China at that time in 1908. But I wonder if it was a relative. And the thing is that his family, Lavra Kornilov's family, were from the Caucasus or from Central Asia. The mother was, I can't remember, she was an indigenous, one of the tribal groups in Central Asia or the Caucasus. So, interesting that there's a Kornilov here with Prince Yusupov in the Caucasus, maybe part of the extended family, I don't know. And then we have Minnie, Aunt Minnie. This is not the Dowager Empress, who was also called Minnie. This is Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna, so Dmitri's biological aunt, his mother's sister. And if any of you have watched the diary entries from 1906, or rather 1907, when Dmitri and Maria and Ella all went to the Crimea, and there was another time when the children went without her, and they stayed again at the Yusupov estate, or previously at the Yusupov estate. Their aunt Minnie was really very keen on spending a lot of time with him. They were the children of her dead sister, and there was even conflict between her and Laming that Dmitri kind of felt stuck in the middle of, that she wanted to spend more time with them, and he wanted them. Ella had told him not to let them go anywhere else and spend the night and do things like that. So there was this conflict. Anyway, I'm digressing. What do we have next time? We have the second half of this letter, and you'll want to listen to that because you'll be hearing more about Ella, and you'll be hearing something very surprising about young Felix Yusupov, who was also there. So something kind of counterintuitive to the assumptions that I had about Dmitri and Yusupov and their friendship. Nothing lurid or lewd. I'm not trying to suggest anything. Something completely different, sorry. Okay, so do come back for that, and I hope to see you then. Bye.